Welcome to the Washington's Trail 1753 webinar in conjunction, and this is in conjunction with Mount Vernon. And we're pleased today to have with us Dr. Jim Ambuske, who is the leader of the Center for Digital History at the Washington Library in Mount Vernon. Washington's Trail 1753 is a commemorative driving trail through western Pennsylvania, which is a route basically following George Washington's trail in 1753. This was Washington's first diplomatic and military venture. Governor of Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie, and directed to go to Fort Le Boeuf at Lake Erie to tell the French to vacate the Ohio territory, which was then claimed by both the French and the British. Washington made this extensive trip, leaving Williamsburg, Virginia, and proceeding north up through Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. It was an uncharted territory. So it was a dangerous trip. And we, on the way back, Washington was suffered an attempted assassination by an Indian. We're looking forward to Dr. Ambuske's title today, or work today, because he's going to discuss Washington in the backwoods, and also lead us through a new gift to Mount Vernon called the Robert Brown American Revolution book, map collection. So we're delighted to have you, Jim, with us, and we're looking forward to hearing that.
No, slide on. Thank you, Marty. That was Marty O'Brien, who is the founder of Washington's Trail 1753. Before we get to Jim's speech, I want to announce that we are developing a new robust website for Washington's Trail, which will incorporate content from the former French and Indian War 250 website. When that website was developed in the early 2000s, all content was written by and approved by authors, historians, and educators. Through this new website, we'll seek to expand partnerships and continue to find ways to promote history, education, recreation, tourism, along the Washington's Trail corridor. In addition, we'll be able to tell more of the French and Indians of War story and the critical role Washington held. However, this comes at a significant cost. We are seeking funds and grants, as well as donations, to help make this project a reality. Donations can be made through our website, washingtonstrail.org, and your donation is tax deductible. A little webinar housekeeping. This webinar is brought to you by Washington's Trail 1753, Butler County Tourism and Convention Bureau, and George Washington's Mount Vernon. The session today will be recorded and posted on our website. Please take a moment to mute your microphone on the computer if you haven't done so already. At the end of the speaker's remarks, there will be time for questions and answers. Please use the chat feature at the bottom to send us a question. To find the chat feature, move your cursor to the bottom center of the screen, and the chat tab will appear. Click on the tab and you'll be able to type your question in the lower right area of the screen. You can send the questions at any time during the presentation. They will be collected and our speaker will address questions when he's done speaking. Depending on the number received, Jim might not be able to get to all the questions. So welcome, Jim, and we're going to turn it over to you right now.
Well, thank you very much, Rodney. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. As I kind of get through my opening shtick here, Rodney, if you wouldn't mind just giving me permission to share my screens. I've got a little bit of a PowerPoint I'd like to share as part of my talk today. I'm delighted to be here with you virtually, although I'm sorry that we could not meet in person. I know, that is much more preferable than meeting in a virtual environment, but I'm glad that we're able to do that in a way that keeps us all safe. And actually, one of the lessons we've learned during this pandemic at Mount Vernon and other cultural institutions is that when we do these kinds of programs in a virtual environment, we often have the ability to reach many more people than we ever thought possible. And we're especially learning that at Mount Vernon with our digital book talk series and some other programming that we've got going on. And I'll just make mention of those in just a moment. But before I do want to thank Jack, Debbie, Rodney, and Marty for inviting me to speak with you today, and for all of the hard work that the Washington's Trail community does to preserve local history and to create opportunities for folks to learn about our early American past. One of the great joys of my youth was working, it was interning at a local historical site in southwestern Ohio. And so I know firsthand the importance of local history and public history. And so I'm very pleased to take part in this effort. And as Rodney said, yes, please do consider how you can support that effort, and especially the website. Since I lead the Center for Digital History, I can tell you firsthand that just because it's digital doesn't mean it's inexpensive. And so if you can have the means and are able to help out the organization at this time, please do so. I'm sure that they would appreciate it. I'm particularly excited to be with you here today because I actually have family ties to Western Pennsylvania. Although I grew up in southwestern Ohio, my grandfather was actually raised in St. Mary's up in Elk County. His dad played for the St. Mary's Tigers, which was a semi-professional baseball team. And I have a lot of family up to the north in Bradford. And my cousin Mike, actually, and his family live in Butler County right now. And my mother-in-law is from Bethel Park, just south of Pittsburgh. So needless to say, Pennsylvania is one of my favorite states. And I'm really delighted and tickled that I could be with you today. And in some ways, it feels like I'm able to come home in a sense because I've spent some time in Western Pennsylvania over the course of my life. And I have all those family connections. So this was just a real treat for me when I was asked to do it. As Marty said, and as Rodney said, I do run the Center for Digital History at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon, where among many of my responsibilities in partnership with my colleagues like Jeanette Patrick, who's actually on joining us today, is to produce programs actually like these that we're doing this morning. And I do want to note just very briefly, let me start sharing my screen here. Actually, Rodney, would you please grant me permission to share? It says host disabled attendee screen sharing. Looks just real quick. And so one of the things I wanted to start out with was actually talking about some of our upcoming virtual programming here in a minute. And I've got a couple of slides, but we've actually got a robust digital talk series out at the Washington Library in Mount Vernon. We began doing digital book talks soon after the Washington Library closed to the public in early March. The library's back open now, but we're not doing in-house public programming. But one of the things we've been able to do, as I said, is to connect with audiences across the United States and across the Atlantic and places far beyond through our digital programming. And so we have very regular book talks. You can join us live on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook to watch some authors who are talking about the latest research in early American history. And actually, at the end of this month, at the end of October, from October the 26th through the 30th, we're having our annual George Washington Symposium. Ordinarily, that would be in person. It won't be this year for obvious reasons. But one of the things we're excited about is we'll have an entire week of live conversations each day at noon focused on key consequential presidential elections in American history. starting with George Washington in the 1790s, looking at the first really contested election in 1800, the Civil War elections in 1860 and 1864, through into the 20th century, looking at Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy in 1960. And so we wanted to bring that kind of content and that kind of educational knowledge to the wider public just before we all go to the polls, or some of you probably already have gone to the polls, but just before the upcoming presidential election. And you can actually find more information about those particular events if you go to www.mountvernon.org/GW Digital Talks. And so you can find more information about the symposium that's coming up here in a week or so, and you can actually watch our entire slate of past book talks with some of the leading authors and historians in the United States, and indeed actually in the United Kingdom as well. And as we're working on getting the screen sharing going, one of the other things that I'll also mention is that in addition to helping to co-produce these live streams at the Washington Library, I'm also the host of our podcast, Conversations at the Washington Library, which is a weekly podcast focused on early American history and the people who teach it. And in fact, today, we released an episode featuring my conversation with my friend George Ironstrack, who's assistant director of the Miami Project at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, talking about the history of the Miami people in the 18th century and the kind of interactions that they had with George Washington, especially the war chief Little Turtle, also known as Michikanakwa. And so it's a great way to learn something about the early American past in a very convenient way. We stream on over 15 different services, and you can subscribe to that podcast on things like Google, Apple, Stitcher, and various other platforms. And you can actually find us at www.mountvernon.org/podcast for more information.
Hey, Jim, Jim, I'm sorry, we're having technical difficulties, and we're not able to get the screen share working.
Okay.
So.
All right. That's just fine. What I'll do is actually we'll drop some links in the chat, I think, to some of the maps that I'm going to talk about, and then that way, fortunately, all the maps that I'm going to talk about today are actually online, so you can actually go see those at the Washington Library and dive into those further at your own leisure. So my agenda this morning is really twofold. And the first is to explore the history of the backcountry around the time of George Washington's 1753 journey, and into what becomes Western Pennsylvania through maps. And I'll sort of describe some of the maps that I'm talking about, since the screen sharing is not working. And I want to talk about why maps and map making were so essential for British Americans like Washington, their French enemies, their respective governments in the colonies in North America and in Europe, what they thought about the backcountry, why they contested it, and why they tried to claim it. And maps were really a way to communicate ideas about places, distant places like Western Pennsylvania, which, as we know, by 1753, was becoming an increasing source of tension between the British, the French, and their Native American allies. Maps were a form of intelligence gathering. They were a means to lay claim to territory and to imagine what that territory might be in the future. And my colleague, Jeanette Patrick, who is actually on the stream with us today, she has been very kind to say that she'll drop links to the individual maps that I'm going to be talking about in the chat feature there, and so that you'll be able to follow along with some of the maps. And so one of the great things is about digital programming is sometimes things go wrong, but there's always a way to fix it, or always a way to pivot to make things work. So I think this is going to work out great. I want to tackle this first objective by way of accomplishing my second, which, as Rodney said, is to introduce you to the Washington Library's recently acquired Richard H. Brown Revolutionary War map collection. And I'll just say a brief word about that collection now. And I encourage you to check it out later today after we've gotten off via the links that we'll drop in the chat. And especially if there's any students out there who have questions about it in the future, please do let us know. We're happy to talk about them. We acquired this collection in 2019 from Richard Brown and Mary Jo Etsia. Richard had spent the last 20 years or so amassing a very sizable collection of American Revolutionary War maps. And he deliberately focused his collecting on the period from roughly 1755 to 1784. So really the moment when North America is transformed by war and revolution. And we go from the era in which George Washington is a young man and starts a global war that wins for Great Britain a massive empire in North America, through the American Revolution, in which George Washington leads the Continental Army to victory over the British and establishes an independent United States. There are over 1,000 maps in this collection. And again, we'll drop those links in the chat today. The majority of these maps are in English and French. They're all original, so they're not, they're contemporary to the period. And the collection includes printed maps, some of which you'll see today. They also include manuscript maps, like maps that Washington would have drawn in the field or would have surveyed on his farm. Knuckle charts that were designed to help mariners navigate American coastlines, and what we call color views and perspectives. These sort of forward-facing views that if you can imagine what North America would have looked like from the deck of a ship as you're coming up to the coast, these views and perspectives were designed to give mariners and other people a sense of the geography as they were approaching the shore. We also got bound atlases like the American Atlas and the Atlantic Neptune. The Atlantic Neptune was probably the most important atlas to depict North America in the 18th century, and also some rare books that have maps in them as well, many of which deal with the American Revolution. So it's a lovely collection. I'm excited for you all to take a look at it when you get the chance. And again, please do let me know at any point whether or not you have any questions, either here or you can reach out to us after the talk today to look at some of these maps and talk about them further. The first map I really want to talk about is called North America from the French of Mr. d'Anville, which was created in 1755 by a man named Thomas Jeffries. And Jeffries was a very famous cartographer. He was a very famous map maker. And he actually goes on to become the geographer to the king, geographer to King George III in the 1760s. So he's a very prominent figure. And he creates and engraves a number of key maps that depict North America and North American spaces in the mid-18th century through the era of the American Revolution. And I'll actually be talking about a lot of maps today that are published in 1755 or thereabouts, and I'll come back to why that was in a moment. But Jeffrey's 1755 map, this North America from the French of Mr. d'Anville, is a very good way of looking at North America and thinking about the balance of power between competing interests across this vast landscape. The British colonies, as you'll see when you click the link that'll come up, the British colonies are, of course, on the east coast of North America. These are settler colonies in which the British are building permanent settler communities. And as Jeffrey shows us through color, as you'll see, certain colonies like Virginia and North Carolina lay claim to territory far beyond the Appalachian Mountains, all the way even through into the Mississippi River. So these colonies and the British, by extension, are trying to lay claim to a vast swath of territory. British Americans, like Washington, like those of his ilk, are keen to expand westward. As you all know, part of Washington's mission in 1753 is to evict the French so that the colonists, either individually or through investments in the Ohio Company, can gain access to the Ohio country's vast, rich agricultural lands. The French, of course, are now in what is Canada, but they are doing colonization a little differently. They are constructing a series of forts in the Ohio Valley. They have less interest in creating the kind of settler communities that the British are, and they're choosing instead to legitimize their claim to the Ohio country through the construction of forts that will allow them to do a couple of things. It allows them to control access to vital waterways through running from the St. Lawrence River in the north down to the port of New Orleans in the south. And they also want to firm up relations with native peoples through trade and military alliances. And alliances with native peoples are key for the French because they are less populous. They need allies in native peoples to help defend their interests against British encroachment in this period. Now, one of the great features of this map is that you can actually zoom into it and look at Western Pennsylvania, and you can see a depiction of the region that Washington's Trail raises awareness about. You can get a sense of where Washington would have gone from Cumberland in Maryland up into Western Pennsylvania near Lake Erie. And then if we were to back out of that space, actually, one of the great things about this map that we can see on it is that it gives a great deal of detail and it pays a great deal of attention to indigenous peoples in this space. And this is no mere curiosity on the part of Jeffreys, the mapmaker. It really reflects what both the British and the French knew to be true in this period, that native peoples, especially certain people like the Haudenosaunee, or more commonly known in English as the Six Nation Iroquois, they hold the preponderance of power in this region at this moment. And I would argue, which is in line with what other historians have said, is that the Six Nations Iroquois are the most powerful people in Eastern North America at this time. And Jeffreys' map really reflects this idea. It reflects this idea and it reflects this reality. And when you look at the map, you'll see the name of the Six Nations inscribed on the map, along with this sort of orange color that signals the extent of their influence and their power. The Six Nations sphere of influence extends from their homelands in northwestern New York into the Ohio country, which they use as a hunting ground and where they hold sway and dominion over Algonquin-speaking peoples like the Miami. So they have a great deal of influence, they have a great deal of power, and they have achieved this position and this power after more than a century of warfare, diplomacy, and consolidation. And so by the mid-18th century, the Iroquois had become very, very skilled at playing the British and the French off of one another in a bid to maintain that power and their place in North America. So when in 1753, when a 21-year-old George Washington, who aspires to be a leading member of the Virginia gentry, who asked Governor Dinwiddie for this assignment in part to elevate his standing amongst his peers, and who wants to command the respect that comes with this status, this young Washington is walking into a world in which neither the British nor the French are really truly the masters of this realm. Now, I certainly don't need to recount the details of Washington's journey to this group, but on the off chance that we have a few folks who stumbled across this symposium through social media, I'll just very briefly note, and as Rodney said at the outset, that Washington was sent by Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie to warn out the French, who had constructed a fort at Fort Le Boeuf in the summer of 1753, and to order them to leave the Ohio country. And the fort was one of three that the fort was one of three that the French had built in this region to reinforce their position and to defend against the British. As I said a moment ago, the French strategy is to construct forts in this space as a means to reinforce military alliances, trade alliances with native peoples, to counter the encroachment for the British. They see this as the way in which they are going to try to control the Ohio country, the entire Ohio Valley, and ultimately, they hope, the Mississippi Valley region as well. Fort Duquesne, for example, probably the most famous fort of the 7 Years' War era in the 1750s and 60s, which later becomes Fort Pitt. Fort Duquesne is one of those forts that's constructed in this chain of forts at the forks of the Ohio. And we have a German map depicting Fort Duquesne and its layout from roughly 1758 or 1759 before its destruction. And so you can see the ways in which that they are constructing forts and thinking about defensive positions and so on and so forth. Washington in 1753 was accompanied by seasoned backcountrymen like Christopher Gist. He was accompanied by a French interpreter. He was accompanied by Indian allies. And he carries a letter from Governor Dinwiddie to the French commander in the region, stating that Ohio belonged to His Majesty King George III, and that the French were, in a sense, to get off the king's lawn. That's the kind of the idea, is to warn out the French and force them to withdraw from the region. Of course, as you know, Washington is very conscious of the fact that he's dealing with officers much more senior than him when he meets the French commanding officers, much more seasoned in frontier diplomacy and warfare. But again, he sees this also as a way in which he can elevate his own status in the eyes of the Virginia gentry and gain position in Virginia politics and hopefully eventually in the British Empire through his service to the crown at this time. Washington and his party arrive at the fort December 1753. The French rebuff the order and send Washington packing on his way back to Williamsburg, where he delivers the bad news to Dinwiddie in early 1754. Now, the Jeffreys map that I talked about earlier is remarkable in its detail. But when you zoom in closer, and I encourage you to do so after this talk is over, you'll find that it's really only detailed at a 30,000 foot level. And that's partly because Jeffreys wants to give us a comprehensive look at the region, but it also reflects how much the British and their colonists don't actually know about the geographic space into which they want to go. Jeffreys creates the map not by surveying the landscape himself, but by drawing on earlier sources, including French sources, as the title of the map suggests. And he's also using the latest reports that he's receiving and the British government is receiving to construct his map. And as Washington's mission shows, it's a landscape that the British are willing to compete for militarily if they have to. And Washington actually does his part to fill this knowledge gap, or at least fill some of this knowledge gap. You know, Washington, as you all know, his first career was not as a soldier, but as a surveyor, beginning in the 1740s, learning that trade, learning how to use rods and chains, learning how to use a compass, learning how to draw maps. And so he puts his skills as a professional surveyor to work. At the forks of the Ohio, during their journey, he surveys a site for a future British fort, which the British would need to control if they hope to have command of the waterways into the interior. Excuse me. When he's at Fort LeBoeuf, he takes an opportunity to inspect the facility. He talks about this in his journal. There's evidence to suggest that he actually sketched a plan of it, but that plan has since been lost. The editors of the Washington papers feel pretty confident that there was a sketch of that fort at one time, but it has since disappeared. But more importantly, Washington draws a map of his journey. And you can see various versions of the map if you Google it online. There's copies in the Library of Congress. There's copies in the Massachusetts Historical Society. The original map that Washington drew is in the United Kingdom. It's the copies that you'll find online are based on the original, and it's not one that we have in the Brown map collection. This is one. This is certainly one that's an addition to it. But what it represents on Washington's part, just like his depiction of Fort LeBoeuf, is a form of intelligence gathering. Washington created a high-resolution depiction of the region that allowed his superiors in Williamsburg and ultimately in London to think about how this crucial landscape fit into the larger map of empire. So if you look at the map, when you look at the map, you'll see that Washington sketched the contours of the Ohio and Allegheny rivers some of their smaller tributaries. He notes the locations of key settlements like the Mingo's Town and Logstown, and most importantly, the potential site for a British fort at the forks of the Ohio. And he also references the French forts just south of Lake Erie. Dinwiddie, who is an ambitious man, who is also a politically savvy man, certainly recognizes the value of Washington's map and the report that he wrote of his mission. The governor had the journal printed in Williamsburg, and he shipped the journal and the map to London to the Board of Trade. And the Board of Trade was the government body charged with overseeing British America. It was their job to figure out and to think about how the empire was supposed to work. And Dinwiddie sends all this information over to London to impress upon these men the necessity of defending the backcountry from French incursions. And Thomas Jeffreys actually was the one who printed the British edition of Washington's journal in 1754. And actually, I don't know the answer to this question, and maybe some of the folks here do, but I do wonder whether or not he drew on Washington's map as he prepared his own very large one, which we have in our Brown collection, but also the one that accompanies certain editions of the journal, of Washington's journal in the 1750s. Now, as I mentioned, the 1750s are the 1750s, the mid-1750s saw a flourish of cartographic activity, of which Jeffreys and Washington's maps were a part. And this was because, again, colonial officials like Dinwiddie and the Board of Trade in London were growing ever fearful that the French would secure the backcountry for themselves, that they would shore up alliances with native peoples, and that by doing so, they would fence in the British along the coast. They would deny them access to that backcountry, to that rich agricultural land into which many British Americans like Washington wanted to go. Washington's mission, after all, was an attempt to prevent this from happening, or at least make it clear to the French that the British claimed their space as their own. Earlier in that decade, earlier in the 1750s, the Board of Trade had asked colonial governments for more information about their respective colonies, and most especially their western regions. Some colonies responded with more enthusiasm than others, but out of that call came the production of some of the most remarkable maps to depict North America in the 18th century. So all of this activity is happening at the same time. Most colonial officials and anyone worth their salt working for the British government in London who has charge or oversight of the colonies is thinking geographically. They recognize that they have a dearth of geographic knowledge. They recognize that they don't have the necessary tools, the necessary maps to plan the British Empire in America and to defend it and to expand it and to plan for its future. So part of what's going on here, part of what's happening with all this flourish of cartographic activity is officials in North America, but also in London, trying to make sense of the empire and what they want it to be. In 1750, for example, Governor Dinwiddie's predecessor commissioned Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson, who was Thomas Jefferson's father, to produce a new map of Virginia that more actively reflected the colony's boundaries and that also fleshed out some of its western regions. The two men, Fry and Jefferson, completed the manuscript map in 1751, and it was published by Jeffreys beginning in late 1753. We have a copy of this map in the Brown collection that was published in 1755. And I want to note two things about it, two really important things. And again, I encourage you to zoom in on these places when you have a chance later on after the talk, or even right now as we're following along. If you look up in the top northwestern corner of the map, you'll see that Jeffreys, see one of the sources that Jeffreys has drawn upon to make some improvements on Fry and Jefferson's original map. He's actually used surveys and information from Christopher Gist, and information that Gist acquired in 1751 when he was looking over the course of the Allegheny and the Ohio rivers. Jeffreys incorporates this information into his 1755 version of the Fry and Jefferson map. And so we can see how geographers and cartographers and map makers are working in real time to use the latest information or the best information available to them to make improvements about what they know about these landscapes and about geographic knowledge overall. If you were to look in the southeastern corner of the map, you'll see a very, very famous cartouche. A cartouche on a map is a kind of elaborate design and a kind of piece of artwork that says something about the map itself, but more importantly, some of the ideas that the map maker hopes to communicate beyond simply the geographic information that they provided. And what you'll see in this cartouche is actually a depiction of enslaved laborers rolling barrels of tobacco to the docks in the Chesapeake Bay and merchants preparing to load those barrels of tobacco on ships. And so what Jeffries is telling us there with that cartouche and what Fry and Jefferson are telling us there with that cartouche is signaling that the Chesapeake economy is intertwined with enslaved labor, that its economy rests on slavery, and that tobacco is the most prominent form of agricultural production in that space. And so I encourage you to look at that. You can capture a real concrete glimpse of how Chesapeake society and the economy works by looking at that cartouche on that map. If we were to look in the western parts of this map, you'll notice that almost no information about the native people who still lived in the region is there, which speaks in part to Fry and Jefferson's desire to produce the map very quickly. They were kind of on a time crunch. Officials in London wanted these maps relatively quickly. But it also has the effect of making the landscape appear vacant and thus ripe for white settlement. And so one of the ideas in the 18th century is that if the idea of terra nullius, of vacant land or unknown lands, and if those lands weren't populated or they weren't thickly populated, then whoever settled them first had essentially the first right to them. And you kind of see that going on there in that particular western parts of the Fry and Jefferson map. So, again, colonial officials have been tasked with coming up with new maps of their colonies in the western regions. Map makers in London are compiling all this information, and they're improving it and taking advantage of the latest information to make corrections where they see fit. And then one of the most important maps, probably, yeah, I think it's probably fair to say the most important map to depict North America in mid-century, in the mid-18th century, was created by a man named John Mitchell. And he creates a map called A Map of the British and French Dominions in North America. As I said, this is easily one of the most important, if not the most important map of mid-18th century North America. Mitchell was a Virginian. He actually studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh before settling in London in the 1740s. He actually had no real formal cartographic or map-making training. He actually studied botany for a while as well. But when he's in London, and this is one of the key aspects of map-making, when he's in London, he acquires a patron. And he acquires a patron and a very powerful person in the form of the Earl of Halifax. The Earl of Halifax was president of the Board of Trade. He's one of the most powerful men in the British government, and he basically dominates the Board of Trade, and it's his vision of the British Empire that we see in the 1750s and early 1760s. Halifax, in many ways, is the architect of the British Empire in this period, and he has a very clear, concrete sense of what the British Empire is, and most importantly, what it could be. Halifax had begun commissioning Mitchell to make maps beginning in 1750. But to create this 1755 map, and I see that Jeanette has just dropped the link for that in the chat here as well. To create this 1755 map, Mitchell drew on maps that colonial governors had sent to London at the Board of Trade's behest, and he also drew on pieces of information like surveys, travel journals, ethnographic studies, and other pieces of data to construct his view of North America. And the result of this was a massive work. And I encourage you all to see it. It's actually printed in 8 sheets, and it's hard to capture the scale and scope of this thing through a digitized image. But if you can imagine if I were to look at those at the Washington Library, just to give you a sense, each individual sheet, I think, is about 3 feet tall. So these are massive pieces, massive maps designed to give you a high resolution depiction of North America. And again, I encourage you to take a look at the link and to zoom in. But what Mitchell's 1755 map shows, and what it does is it visualizes how the British, and really in particular the Earl of Halifax, thought about the British Empire in North America. The map really embodies Halifax's desire for a cohesive British America directed against the French threat, one that has the potential to dominate the continent. So if you look in the south, in the southern reaches of Mitchell's map, in the southern colonies, we find that the colonies' borders extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean. These lines run right off the map. They run right over any claims that the Spanish might have had to the land, to say nothing of the native peoples who lived there. And if you look at the north, what we see is Mitchell wants us to show us is the French threat to more contested regions like the Ohio country. So unlike in the south, where the British are projecting a much more confident position by showing borders that extend to the Pacific, what Mitchell and really the Earl of Halifax are saying here in the north is that the Ohio country is up for grabs. And that if we, the British, ignore that threat, if we fail to act, if we will not only lose access to this region and its potential for future colonial settlement, we'll lose our influence and command over the native peoples who live there as well. So in a sense, they're saying, if we lose the heart of the continental interior, who's to say we won't lose the whole thing? And we can't forget that a lot of British subjects on both sides of the Atlantic stood to lose a lot of money or potential income if the British can't defend the backcountry. You know, I mentioned earlier that the Ohio Company was one of the parties who had a vested interest in opening up this space for settlement. Governor Dinwiddie has a 5% interest in the company. George Washington's brothers are also investors. And so if the British cannot command this space, if they can't turn this place to their advantage, people are going to lose a lot of money and potential opportunity. And this map takes on a lot of new meaning because it's published in 1755, only months after the younger George Washington's debacle at Jumeauville-Glen starts the French and Indian War. And so again, we can also think of the Mitchell map as a kind of piece of propaganda. And it's a piece of propaganda designed to bolster support for the war effort, the French and Indian War, what we call in Europe the 7 Years' War. It offered the British at once a compelling vision of future prosperity and imperial domination of the continent, and also potential catastrophe should they fail to successfully challenge the French. And Halifax, I think, intended it as such, certainly among government ministers, and then more cheaply printed versions of this map illuminated that threat for the British public. There's one more, I know we're running short on time here, so there's one more map that I want to discuss, and then I'm happy to talk about other maps as well that we have in the collection. But the last major map that the Brown collection I'd like to talk about just for a moment is Lewis Evans's 1755 map, a general map of the Middle British colonies in America. And I saved him for last because he's somewhat of a local boy, in a sense, for all of you up in Pennsylvania. Evans was born in Wales, but he immigrated to Philadelphia in the mid-1730s, where he becomes friends with Benjamin Franklin. In the 1740s, he works as a surveyor. He makes trips into Iroquois country. He produces a few published maps, including of New York and eastern Pennsylvania. But he's best known for this 1755 map of the Middle Colonies. And this map, the copy of the map that we have in the Brown collection was published in London, although Benjamin Franklin did publish a printed version in Philadelphia. Unlike Mitchell, who drew on the work of others, Evans draws on his own surveying experiences to create this map. And although he, like other map makers, of course, used other sources to finish the work, he is drawing on some of his own experience as a surveyor, as a map maker, to create this piece. Evans's map is also designed to highlight the French threat to the backcountry. He actually produces a pamphlet to go along with the map in which he excoriates British policy for allowing the French to get so darn close to British settlements. And I actually saw a copy of this pamphlet in the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh a few years ago, Evans actually writes a second pamphlet along similar lines that gets him into a lot of trouble because he criticizes government officials for negligence, and this eventually lands him in prison on charges of treason for a while. And importantly, one of the things I want to talk about, just to close with this section, is that Evans does something a little different than Mitchell. And he and Mitchell were rivals. Mitchell, in his map, as you'll be able to see, he treats the Iroquois as a kind of tributary state or tributary nation under the British, which really reflects both his British exceptionalist view of North America in this period, but also an idealized world in which white colonists stood above native peoples. Evans doesn't do that. Evans shows the Iroquois in their own right. And as I said, the Iroquois are one of the major powers in Eastern North America. And we can attribute Evans's choices in part to this local knowledge of having local knowledge of the geography, of being a provincial who has a clear understanding of local geographic politics than do map makers in London. And as I said, we have to keep in mind that these maps are produced in a time of war, and they are produced again as in a time of great anxiety in North America and in Europe, as the French and the British are first eye each other across shifting lines in the backcountry, and then finally come to blows beginning in 1754 in North America and globally 2 years later during the 7 Years' War. And during that war, as you might suspect by this point, map making takes on a greater urgency. Both the British and the French send scores of military engineers and cartographers to North America to map out waterways, to scout defensive positions, to probe the landscape, to create new maps to help their respective commanders to develop strategies to defeat their enemies and win the war. Captain James Cook, for example, the famous Captain James Cook, gets his start in the 7 Years' War. He plays a key role in mapping the St. Lawrence River in Quebec, which was instrumental in allowing General James Wolfe to defeat the French at Quebec in 1759, which turns the tide of the 7 Years' War in favor of the British. And as the war was over in 1763, the British realized that if they were to consolidate their gains, if they were going to more effectively manage this empire, they would need new and better maps. And so the last thing I'll say is that to close out my talk today and to get to your questions, is that in 1763, when the war ends, King George III issues orders to his government to launch what is called the General Survey of North America. And the idea is similar to along the lines of what the Board of Trade and the British government had tried in the 1750s, was to get better, new, and high-resolution maps of American spaces so they can begin to think about how they can more effectively manage the empire. And so they want new depictions of the American coastline so that they can improve shipping and navigation to help power the economy. They want to figure out how they can draw a boundary line that runs roughly along the Appalachian Mountains from north to south to separate British colonists in the east from Indian peoples in the west. Of course, as we've been talking about, the British recognize the agricultural potential of the backcountry. They recognize its strategic value, but what they realized by 1753 is they can't really defend it. And that the continued westward movement by colonists would potentially lead to further violence between white Americans and native peoples. And so what the British want to do is essentially preserve the interior as a vast Indian reserve. And they want to focus more attention on the existing colonies like Virginia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. They want to draw new maps of these spaces. They want to impose new taxes to help pay down the costs of the 7 Years' War. And they want to populate newly acquired territories like Prince Edward Island in East and West Florida with British subjects. And I'll ask Jeanette to pop into the chat a really, really cool map of East Florida, and particularly of the town of St. Augustine. And this map was actually carried by the Marquis de Lafayette when he was in America during the American Revolutionary War. So in sum, what the British, what colonists like Washington are trying to do, what governors like Dinwiddie are trying to do, is to improve their geographic sense of North America, so that they can better manage the empire, they can look towards the future, and so that they can have a better chance at what they imagine as a peace and prosperity in their own time. As a consequence of those decisions, in London and in the colonies, and particularly in the 1760s, when they start to impose taxes, the British officials start to think about how to more effectively manage the empire. Some colonists, like George Washington, who had fought in the backcountry, who had claimed many thousands of acres in the Ohio country, began to wonder whether or not the British Empire was really the place of peace and prosperity that they had imagined on the map. And as we all know, by the 1770s, many American colonists had decided that it was not. So I will stop there and thank you very much. And I just want to say thanks to Jeanette for dropping all those links in the chat for us.
Hey, great. Thank you very much, Jim. If you click on the chat button in the bottom middle of your screen, the chat dialogue space will open up, and Jeanette from Mount Vernon has been posting links to maps, so that'll be really great. And we'll also send those out in a follow-up email and have them listed on our website. Again, our apologies for the technical difficulties. One question, if you have questions, feel free to type those in now. One question that was raised: the journals of Washington and Christopher Gist, they talk about the distances they traveled in a day. How accurate should we think of these distances? Do you have a thought, or what do historians say?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. And in preparation for this talk, I looked through Washington's journal a little bit and through Gist journals, which I hadn't. I'll be honest, I haven't looked through in a long time. So it was really fun to come back to those. I would say, because Washington was trained as a surveyor, because Gist was an experienced figure in the backcountry who had a lot of local knowledge, and was a surveyor himself, I would imagine that their understanding of distance was pretty highly accurate. And one of the things that you'll see in some of the maps that we have in our collection is that you'll actually see tables that the map makers, or the engravers at least, have put on the maps to express distances between major American spaces and cities. And so in some of these 1755 maps, you'll see tables that are drawing on sources like Gist or other folks who have been in this space, sort of figuring out, what's the distance between Cumberland and Fort LaBeouf and other places like that. They'll put that data on the map itself, and so that people who are viewing it can get a sense of the distances between these various places in this area. So that's a terrific question.
We have any other one kind of question about visiting Mount Vernon? Are any of these maps or copies of these maps available for view at the library? And what's the status about Mount Vernon during the time of coronavirus?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you very much for asking. So I'll take the Mount Vernon question first. Like a lot of places, we did close to the public in March, and we remained closed to the public through middle of June, in which we began a sort of soft phased opening up. And so Mount Vernon is open. There is controlled access in terms of limited numbers of people per day, but you can go to Mount Vernon if you so desire. I encourage you to do so if you can safely. Of course, don't travel if it's not safe to do so. But you can go. The mansion, the first floor of the mansion, is open. Some of our educational center is open, although some of the features like touch screens and things like that are disabled for the time being. The library itself is operating a little differently. The library is actually a private library, but it's very public facing. But at this time, though, we're only allowing our research fellows who are on fellowships and scholarships to come in and work in the library, and only then in a very limited number. The maps themselves, that's also an excellent question. The maps are such a recent acquisition, and we had just barely had time to begin the process of properly cataloging and figuring out our strategy to store them, that by the time the pandemic hit, we essentially had to stop all those operations. And so right now they are sitting in the library down in the controlled environment storage room. So unfortunately, they're not available for view at the moment, but we're hoping that we'll have opportunities in the future to mount exhibitions. We're hoping, and we're actually working on ways to deliver the maps that we have in our collection, but also many more maps in other collections to you digitally. And so there'll be various ways that you'll be able to see the maps eventually. But once do be on the lookout, because once we are in a position where we can open fully, I think, and we'll be doing some exhibitions centered around some of these maps. We actually had one up that I actually curated, and we got it up in February, and we shut down in March, so like nobody got to see it, so which was a real bummer. But what are you going to do?
Here's a very specific Northwest Pennsylvania map from Mike Baker, who has seen some of these maps and says there's an area labeled Buffalo Swamp. Do you have any idea on where this might currently be located?
Unfortunately, I don't, and I actually saw that too. And one of the great things about these maps are like looking at places that are familiar to all of us in the modern era, but then seeing these different place names and seeing these different locations. And so I actually don't know, unfortunately, what that is a reference to. But I would imagine that if we look in the primary sources, we'll be able to find, journals, diaries, letters, things like that. We'll be able to find reference to it. And I would imagine probably some of my colleagues have written about these spaces and described it before.
One last question that came in was what bibliographic map describers or descriptors are most helpful if you're searching in map catalogs?
Oh, that's a really great question, and I'll add something to that at the end about some books to look at about some of these maps as well. When you're thinking about how to search for the maps, one of the easiest ways to do it is simply type in something like Pennsylvania, because you're not only going to get a map that is dedicated to Pennsylvania, you're going to get a whole range of maps that incorporate Pennsylvania into a larger geographic space. And so a lot of the maps that we talked about today, Pennsylvania is featured prominently on those maps, but it is in relation to other colonies like Virginia, Maryland, New York, Delaware, spaces like that. So simply giving a place name, like a major place name like Pennsylvania, is one good way to do it. Another is to type in a year or a range of years that will pull up a variety of maps that were published in that same era, and allow you to see what map makers are doing in that same period. And then another tip is just simply like keywords, like prominent keywords like Iroquois or boundary line, proclamation, Atlantic, things like that will call up various maps that speak to these topics specifically, but also, again, like the Pennsylvania example, think about these topics in relation to other maps. And I'll say, to add to that, in terms of bibliography, there are actually a couple of books that I would encourage you to check out if you're more interested in these maps. But actually, one of them, this one in particular, it's kind of hard to see on the screen here, but this is called The New Map of Empire. This is actually by one of my mentors, Max Edelson at the University of Virginia. And I actually based a good portion of my talk today on Max's book, in part because I worked with him on a digital project about his maps. But The New Map of Empire, what Max talks about in that book is how the British, how the colonists are thinking about geography and how they're thinking about spaces like Western Pennsylvania and thinking about its importance. And so it's a really good resource to read and to check out if you want something much more concrete. And the final one I'll mention is actually Richard Brown co-authored a book based in part on his collection, but also maps from the British Library and the Library of Congress, called Mapping the American Revolution. It's a big, gorgeous, I don't have a copy of it, but it's a big, gorgeous coffee table book with full productions on color maps, including some of my favorites, like the Richard Williams watercolors of the British occupation of Boston in 1775. So those are two places to go to find some additional information about these maps.
Well, great, Jim. Thank you so much for that great presentation. Again, we'll be sharing these links to the map of the Brown collection. This presentation has been recorded, and a link will be posted on our website, www.washingtonstrail.org. Please check out our website for more information about Washington's 1753 mission, our group's activities, and how to get our newsletter that features history articles and book reviews. And please consider a contribution so we can build a new, robust website to preserve all the great information that was created for the French and Indian War 250 anniversary. We need $10,000 to complete this website project, but any donation will put us closer to that goal. And thanks again to all who participated, especially Butler County Tourism and Convention Bureau, who hosted this Zoom event. And with that, I think we'll close. Thanks all for joining us.
Thanks so much, everybody, for having me. Have a great day.